Hi, my name is Jennifer Simpson, and I'm the Provost and Vice President Academic at Ryerson University, and I'm here with Melanie Panitch. It's great to be here with you, Melanie.
Hello, I'm Melanie Panitch. I'm Executive Director of the Office of Social Innovation at Ryerson. I've been at Ryerson for slightly over 20 years. I began as the founding director of the School of Disability Studies, and I'm very happy to be here in conversation with Jennifer Simpson this morning.
I'll just give a few details about the subject of our conversation today, Melanie, and then we will also hear some comments from you about what we're going to dive into. We're here to talk about my book that came out a few years ago, Longing for Justice, Higher Education and Democracy's Agenda, when and why it was written. I wrote this book really between 2006 and for about the next 9 or 10 years. So I started thinking about it in 2006, and it was kind of just, it's interesting to work on a book because it's really a prolonged period of reflecting on a certain set of subjects or themes, and I really enjoy that. At any rate, it took me about 10 years to think about, conceptualize, and then write and publish the book. Why it was written, I think academics, often intellectuals, we have these conversations going on in our heads. That's how I work. And I'd long been interested in equity. So my earlier work in a book about 10 years prior to this one that came out was about racism in higher ed. And so at this point, about a decade later, I was quite interested in thinking about, with that topic of racism and equity, what are the university's obligations? So the first decade of my research really focused on race, equity, white privilege, white supremacy, how to move away from racism institutionally and in our organizations and universities. And then that led me to think about, okay, I thought about racism kind of as a subject, how we inhabit it, what we do about it, how we resist it. And then I wanted to think about the second book. This book that we're talking about today is really about what are the obligations of higher education to equity and the public good. I think the other why it was written was to bring that conversation outside of my head, to bring it to a broader audience. I really see the book as a conversation. The ideas are moving, they're fluid, they were a long time in development, but they're also complex and changing, I think. And so it's a kind of openness that I was interested in to a conversation. And then finally, I think the why it was written was so I could think about how to apply some of my intellectual work on anti-racism to a broader university agenda or a set of priorities. The intended audience, really, it was faculty members, first of all, my colleagues. I was always thinking about people in my department where I was working at the time, or people that I would meet at conferences who were thinking about these topics. I'm interested in change. So it was also about how to engage with my colleagues with the goal of change, not just thinking about something, but doing something differently.
Thanks very much. That's a great introduction. Jennifer, I'm interested in the fact that we're having this conversation this week during Social Justice Week. And this has a very interesting history at Ryerson because it's organized by the Unifor Chair in Social Justice and Democracy, which is a chair funded by the labor movement a decade ago. And it's important to sort of pause and think why we're having this conversation now, and I welcome that. In your book, which I read and really appreciated as an autoethnography, how many of your reflections and analysis come out of the classroom, and there's a number of situations. But there's one in which you describe a run-in with the senior academic lead in your university at that time. And you said that in a way, and described the way in which you felt put down by this academic's comment to you. And you write that administrators routinely indicate in a variety of settings what type of educational conversations they will support. I think it's really significant we're having this conversation during Social Justice Week with the Office of Social Innovation, which is predicated on social justice. Why do you think it's important that this is being recorded and contributing to the work of the university at this point?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Melanie. Thanks. So maybe just a couple minutes on the situation. I remember, yes, that example in the book where actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it was the person in my role at an institution in the States. This was 20 years ago even. And we were at a regional conference together, and I had just been at a national conference on higher ed and had made a presentation and was telling her about that presentation. And in the presentation at the national conference, I had spoken about a situation where a student had brought up an example of police violence against the Black community, a Black community in the States, and that I had encouraged conversation about that. I had noted that my understanding that institutional racism exists in the States where I was teaching at the time. And the administrator responded very, very critically that I should not be talking about that, or at least affirming that that institutional racism existed. And I was, in fact, I was a pre-tenure faculty member at that time. I didn't have tenure. In fact, my tenure case was going through the different offices that it goes through. So that was on my mind at the time. I think the point that you raised, Melanie, and that I make in the book is that places of higher education need to be places where we can have conversations about difficult topics. I talk in the book about naming and imagining. We need to be able to name what's happening in the world. We need to be able to give plain language. We need to be able to respond to students' experiences. And in this case, it was a Black student who had familiarity with police violence against Black communities in the States. Of course, we always need to base as faculty on research, on evidence, on clear thinking. But I guess part of the classroom environment for me has been about talking about institutional racism. And from a leadership perspective, that naming and imagining, that's really what I hope that I can contribute to at Ryerson, to increasing that. I know that's already going on in many settings, in many situations, in many contexts and units at Ryerson. And I guess that's what leaders can do, is open up that space for that kind of discussion. Because to move towards equity, we have to be able to talk about what's happening, the reality that we're in. And there will be different perspectives on that. There will be disagreement, but we need to open up those spaces. And administrators need to clearly support those spaces rather than restrict or narrow those possibilities.
Thank you. You recognize that education is not neutral and identify as a critical scholar. And that certainly resonated to my background and work in disability studies, and recognizing that you speak of defining the subject. And I guess in disability studies, just to take an example, one thinks about how you frame the question is going to determine the intervention, or how you're going to approach to decide whether it's an issue, a problem. I wonder if you could speak to this question of neutrality. You certainly, align with Freire and a textbook I've used in a social innovation course. So there's much that we will talk about after this interview, but certainly it's an opportunity to ask you that now.
Yeah, sure. I'm curious, you mentioned that your work in disability studies has helped you think about how to frame the subject. So I'm curious about what's going on for you there, or where that question's coming from for you.
Sure. The history of thinking about disability has been as fixing the deficit in the person through treatment, through diagnosis, through a medical intervention. In disability studies and coming out of the disability rights movement, the reframing is a socio-political question. It's an economic question. Is architecture built to include people? How do we understand the barriers. Why do we have a segregated system of education that we're trying to overcome? What have been the institutional responses? It's been large congregate care, institutional care, and only now trying to reframe it and reimagine it. Because when you think about illness and medicine, you don't think about poverty. You don't think about racism. You don't think about discrimination. So a socio-political framing, which is what our School of Disability Studies at Ryerson is based on, gets you to that place. And so that intervention is very different than if you're talking about it as a medical issue.
Okay, that's really helpful. Maybe one connecting point there where I'll start when I think about neutrality is that question of what you said, that from a medical model, someone may not think about poverty and disability or race and disability. And so I talk about the concept of that we're implicated. Another way to think about that is we're embedded in situations. So we're in a position, we're connected to all kinds of sets of relationships. And those have ethical consequences, how we're positioned. So I think the reality of the impossibility of neutrality is that as faculty, we're in our teaching, to some degree, we're setting up for students what's possible. We're choosing in our syllabi and in our courses what to focus on, the subject matter and the content. To some degree, we're habituating them to what I call a form of what John Dewey called a form of associated living. Another way to think about that is the we, who's in the we. So if I talk about we, whether it's my community, maybe I live in residence, there's a we for students who live in residence. For faculty, there's a we in terms of their disciplinary association. As faculty, when we teach a course and we decide on the content and the subject, it's going to habituate students to a certain kind of world and a certain way of interacting with that world. And that's what I mean when I say that we can't be neutral. Because in habituating students to a certain kind of orientation of interacting or being in the world, in setting up what's worth learning, as faculty, we decide what's worth learning, what's worth paying attention to, spending time on. When we do that, we then we orient students and we offer a way of imagining the future. We're kind of indicating to them what's possible for imagining the future. And that can be, in a very simple way, it can be challenging the status quo, or a lot of times when faculty are maybe not thinking about the implicatedness of our teaching and our work, it might be supporting the status quo. And I don't want to oversimplify that either. I think that sometimes we're simultaneously challenging business as usual and affirming business as usual when it comes to institutional practices. But I guess that's what I mean when I say we can't be neutral, that we're showing up, we're indicating what's important, we're pointing to a certain kind of future and way of living with each other. We're deciding, are we explicitly attending to equity? Is that on the table, out front? Is it part of the subject? Or is that in the background or not visible at all? And if it's in the background, that's also an agenda of affirming business as usual. So that's what that's my thinking about the impossibility of neutrality.
Right.
Yeah.
You use, speaking of business, you use a really lovely example about tackling or interrogating, I guess, the term improved thinking. And you use that as an illustration. Well, improved thinking can be an end to itself, but it can be used to enhance a business's profits, or it can be used to charge a business with unfair hiring practices. So improved thinking doesn't actually get you to the point of, I think, as you also advocate, an improvement in the material conditions of people's lives, and that they're the end point or the goal or the aspirational point of education should be to have an impact in that way. And that resonates with how we understand social innovation at Ryerson, which is there needs to be a shift in favor of a disadvantaged group, whether it's wealth or resources or water accessibility. But kind of the test for social innovation, for social justice, would be, is there a shift in favor of a disadvantaged group? And so I think there's some resonance there that that leaped off the page for me. You talk about curriculum and how we might approach, or curriculum is a vehicle to approaching knowledge and education. I wonder if you might sort of highlight some of your thinking there.
Yeah, first I'll say that I really like that definition. I've heard a lot about innovation. I've read about it, but that's a really good, I like defining social innovation in a social justice framework as requiring a shift for a disadvantaged group and what that means. Before I dive into curriculum, one of the questions I ask in the book, which kind of comes before my thinking about curriculum, is what is the obligation that universities have to public life? And I think that's such an important question, because I would say that in everything we do, faculty, and everything that faculty do at a university, we're responding to that question in some way, whether or not we're conscious of that, or whether or not that question is in the foreground. But our roles are public. We're in a public institution. We're teaching students who are going to go out into the world. We're doing scholarly and creative activity that will go out in the world as well. So when I think about those obligations, I'll make a couple examples of that implicatedness. So when I was working on the book, there was I was at the University of Waterloo at the time, and one day I woke up and started working, and on the web page for Waterloo, there was a co-op student on the front page and a picture of him, and he was at a tar sands, oil sands development or work site. And then I think that day or the day before, I went to a lecture by an Indigenous Studies scholar who talked about the environmental issues and Indigenous issues in Canada. And so I think that's an example of that first of all, we're implicated. So that co-op site where that student is, what's happening there? What's it doing to the environment? How is it impacting the Indigenous communities in that region? So that's my kind of belief, that we don't have there's no possibility to be on the fence in these situations when we're thinking about co-op or teaching. I think how that informs curriculum is that, I guess, from a broader perspective, when faculty decide what to teach, and when we're thinking about justice, the first question that they answer, that all faculty answer, is what is the subject? What is the subject for this course? What am I going to cover? We talk about coverage or content. We might rely on our disciplines for that. Often our disciplinary, sometimes it's accreditation that informs us in terms of what is the subject. I think I'm asking, one of the questions I'm asking is what is the subject if we think about equity as part of the obligation that universities have to public life? So we think at universities, we think about equity in terms of representation and hiring. We want to make sure that we have representation from broad communities across Canada, for example, or internationally. We think about our policies and procedures in terms of equity, that they're fair and accessible and equitable. And I want to add to that consideration of equity the question of how are we educating students to contribute to an equitable world? And so that's a question of capacity and outcome, pedagogical curricular outcomes. And so when I think about curriculum, that's a question that I think is relevant for all faculty, particularly when we're considering social justice or the obligations of higher education to the public good. What's the subject in any given course, in any given discipline, in any given program? And how does that subject engage equity? How does engineering, or we're thinking about working on a plan for a School of Medicine at Ryerson. If we're thinking about healthcare, we have nursing programs in the creative school. In any of those faculties, in any of those programs, what does the subject, when a faculty member thinks about what's the subject, what does that have to do with equity? What capacities are students bringing out into the world? So that's a kind of high level response to that question of curriculum.
In thinking about how one might deliver a curriculum in social innovation, which is where I'm teaching, we have a minor in social innovation. There's an emphasis on, for example, understanding history and recognizing that there's a deep understanding required of the social problems and how they're rooted in institutional ideas, values, practices, and entrenched advantage and disadvantage as one of the strategies to try to get at the higher order issues that you're talking about. And also the idea of bringing in voices. Sheila Rowbottom, in the 60s wrote about women hidden from history. There are many voices. Disability studies talks about their mantra, nothing about us without us. So bringing in voices that aren't traditionally heard in the university, but recognizing forms of knowledge that have a lot to contribute. And I guess the other would be through interdisciplinarity. And Social Innovation has a project right now called Apathy to Empathy on the Indigenous water crisis, working across the institution. So those are some strategies that might start to bridge the gap between how do we do the kind of thing that you're speaking to.
Yeah. Let me ask a question about that. That's a great kind of insight into how, from a social innovation perspective. And I guess one thing that I think about a lot in terms of teaching about equity or teaching towards capacities that support equity is, you mentioned history, and I would put alongside that a critical analysis of power, of how power works. So I'm curious, is that a big topic in social innovation in your experience, or how does power fit into the discussion when you link social justice with social innovation?
Yes, it comes up repeatedly. We try to, or in this particular course, we try to organize it along the line of wicked problems. So those significant social challenges that you might talk about and naming them. And in each of them, just recently, we've been talking about white saviorism and philanthrocapitalism. And how we might critique that. We've been looking at mutual aid, particularly coming out of the pandemic, to relate to students' experiences in terms of helping their neighbors or the community fridges, and bring in that analysis in whatever we're doing. It's critical.
Yes, it is. Yes, yeah. It's exciting to think about. I have an understanding of power in thinking about that in the classroom in my own teaching experience, which was largely in communication courses, is that when I was teaching a lot, that's what I was teaching. But I guess I get really excited about the ways in which from any faculty or any disciplinary perspective, we can start asking questions about power. And at a broad level, I think about power as the ability to make decisions about resources, the ability to make decisions about the conditions that determine how we live. And in any field, I think any academic, faculty member, administrator can think about, how is power working in this area that I study? Who gets to make decisions? Who's at the table? Who's influencing the conditions in which we live? How do those conditions help certain groups or privilege certain groups and harm or do violence to other groups? So these are really great questions, I think, that, as you're pointing out, can really cross settings, that we can ask those in a social innovation setting. We can ask them in a disciplinary setting. So I think those are great questions to consider.
And I think much of the work that we now call social innovation, and that's another conversation about language and labels and why now, but the work of social movements has really brought around the incredible change. We wouldn't have thought about universal health care in Canada as a social innovation, and yet it was a social movement of people driven by personal commitment to make a change because something in their life needed changing based on their experience. So that for sure is a way in which power is exposed and exercised.
Yes.
I think just to add to that, there's some professional courses, of course, that would see the message to students as being professional, be aloof, be dispassionate, be contained. But I think social innovation and social justice work, you're in the frame, you're engaged, you're there, and it's also a place for, you talk about imagination and the need for imagination to be able to see a future that's better than the one we're in. But I wanted to talk about the title of your book, which I think speaks volumes about that sense of aspiration, I guess, but also more. So It's called, I'll just repeat, it's called Longing for Justice, Higher Education and Democracy's Agenda.
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a really great question. And it opens up a lot of, I guess, my thinking and feeling around the book. And I guess the first word is longing. And, longing is something we do with all of ourselves. At least that's how I do it. We do it with our head and our heart, and it happens over time. And longing changes in us. And at least for me, when I know what I'm longing for, it kind of brings up my deepest commitments and what I find most meaningful. And if I think about my own longing related to justice, I remember a conversation I had, the video that was done with me, and I talked about when I was a student, like when I was 20 or 18, 19, 20 years old. And even then, I was thinking about justice. So when I look at the title of that book, it's a longing that's continued throughout my life. And so the first thing to say is that as an intellectual, I have feelings, I have a heart, I have a head, and I have a body, and I have commitments and values and passions. And I think that word longing is to say that this book is a longing for justice. It's a longing for a different world. I think it's a longing because this is an urgent matter. In my first book, when I talked about race, I talk about that I don't want to live in a world in which I'm contributing to racism and colonialism. I want to figure out how to do that less. And that's a longing for me. So I guess that's the word longing. And it's a book that comes from my head and my heart. Justice, maybe that word is more self-explanatory. The higher education and democracy's agenda, I think there is a lot of talk about how education needs to be neutral and dispassionate, and that we shouldn't bring our emotions and our commitments, our feelings. And this is a hard topic. I'll just acknowledge that this is complex. The role of emotions. When emotions are strong, we can move into behavior that might be defensive, that might shut down conversation. So I guess what I'm saying is we have to be thoughtful about our emotions and our feelings and our passions. I want myself to be collegial about those, to be thoughtful, to realize that we have differences of opinion and thought and experience and aspiration. But the higher education and democracy's agenda is to say, part of that is referencing that in North America, I've worked in the United States and in Canada, we are aspirational democracies. We may not be those things in practice. There's going to be various opinions about to what degree we've achieved an engaged, vibrant democracy. But at the least, I think we can agree that in North America, we do want to be in an equitable society. It's a priority. And so I think in that sense, we're moving towards something specific. We're moving towards a set of aspirations that does put a value on equity. It says it's important. It's in the foreground. So I guess that's the story behind the title. Right. Yeah. What do you think, Melanie, for social innovation is the biggest challenge going forward related to social justice?
I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what social innovation is. And certainly at Ryerson, as I would tell it, when I was first becoming aware, and I've been at Ryerson a little over 20 years, started to hear about social innovation, it really had to do with the digital media zone and technology and apps, and that kind of was a focus. And then there seemed to be a lot of interest in social innovation related in the TRSM and entrepreneurship and strategies for kind of ventures and the zones. But I was then in a faculty of community services and disability studies, and none of these interpretations of social innovation really resonated for me, because it isn't something that's new and shiny that just started today, just because we're using social innovation as kind of a buzzword. In every university, you go to the university fair and you would see social innovation, most innovative university on all the marquees. So in trying to think about what that would mean in faculty, which is where I was at the time, when in fact I knew that disability studies wouldn't even be at a university had there not been a struggle for the kind of knowledge to produce
Mhm.
research in that area. Midwifery wouldn't be at a university, child and youth care, social work, and add to your so I think the challenge was to try and position innovation in a way that resonated with people who had been at it for 50 years and longer. So I think the challenge is, it's self-evident to me, but it's probably helping others to, or communicating effectively to see who we could also draw in to understand the social side of innovation. And to be fair, we have had some really excellent partnerships with engineering, particularly socially innovative creations and research during COVID. Suddenly, the significance of balconies becomes, becomes relevant in a way that it wasn't maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So we're trying to work and think about, I think that's a challenge. And I think many people are doing work that would fall into social innovation and social justice, but probably don't see it that way. And that's fine. But it is the challenge, I think, is to keep the social forefront.
Yeah, that I'll conclude with a couple comments related to that. I think we started, and at the beginning I talked about the importance of a conversation, why I wrote the book, and I want to return to that with a couple of questions that ask. I think everyone can enter the question of social justice and social innovation with this imagining, which is a creative space. It's a concrete space. It's a practical space. It's a conceptual space. It's a community space. It's all of those things. But what do we imagine? What's the world we imagine from each of our roles, from where we're implicated, where we sit, where we stand, where we are? And I think that's, the question of what future do I want to imagine? If I'm a faculty member, what's the subject? If I'm a student, where are my passions? How can I think about myself and my sphere of influence, where I have agency, and the contributions I'm going to make to the world that we're living in, to the various we's that we're a part of? So I guess I think those are all good questions to stay in conversation about. How do we name the world we're in terms of power, access, justice, and how do we imagine the world we want to be in? And how can we do that from both where we're positioned and then within the communities that we inhabit? So thanks again, Melanie, for the conversation. And it was great to meet you today and have such a great and engaging discussion about how we enter these questions and move through them.
Thank you. I look forward to meeting you in person, but welcome to Ryerson. And
right.
I enjoyed this a lot. Thank you.
Yes, me too. Thanks very much.